Welcome to Baruch College. Welcome to the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs. My name is David Birdsell. I'm Dean of the Marxe School, and I'll be moderating today's panel. I am delighted to be able to convene this conversation this morning about something that's vital for us as a program that educates people for careers in public service, and particularly public service in the arena of international affairs. And that question is, as you see on the front of your program, Re-envisioning International Affairs Education for a New Era. So this morning we're going to be exploring a number of topics. We're going to be talking about what the status quo, is there a status quo approach to public affairs education, particularly international affairs? If there is, what's good about it, what's not, what should we be doing differently? And as we think about the different ways that we can prepare people for service in this arena, what impact does that have on the careers that they will pursue, and how should we be thinking about those careers going forward? We have a terrific group of scholars here today to talk about that issue. Going to my far right to begin, I'm happy to welcome Sakiko Fukuda-Parr. She's Professor of International Affairs and the Director of the Julian Studley Graduate Program in International Affairs at the New School, just a few blocks to our south. Next to Sakiko is Dipali Mukhopadhyay. Dipali is Associate Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University and also a faculty affiliate of the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. That's the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, just a few, actually more than a few blocks, a couple of miles to our north. And closest to me and to us is Zachariah Mampoli, who is the Marx Endowed Chair in International Affairs and Professor in the School of Public and International Affairs right here. You have more extensive biographies in your programs, and I invite you to take a look at those. These are accomplished people who have devoted their careers to thinking about these topics as research scholars, but also as pedagogues, and that's where we're going to start today. And before I go further and ask our panelists to give a sort of overview from their point of view of where these topics fall out, I'd also like to welcome the president of Baruch College, Mitchell B. Wallerstein, who is also an international affairs expert and a member of the faculty of the Marxe School. So welcome, sir. Zach, I wonder if I could ask you to kick us off. When we talk about the status quo in international affairs education, what are we talking about, and what are the holes in that approach as you see it vis-a-vis contemporary affairs?
Right, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out so early in the day. It's really great to be here and to be joining the Marxe faculty. So when we were first thinking about what this panel could be about, I guess for me, I really thought about my own individual experiences as a young student who really wanted to be involved with international politics as an 18-year-old, and not really understanding what this field called international relations was and international affairs more broadly. And I think my first experience in an Intro to International Affairs course was so striking to me because the entire syllabus was Western global North scholars, and almost all male. And that was really interesting because my experience as an immigrant to this country had really shaped my interest in this subject of international affairs, and there was almost no representation from people from Africa, South Asia, Latin America, were completely absent on the syllabus. And so I approached the professor at some point in the semester and I asked him, why is there nobody from outside of Western Europe and North America on the syllabus? And he said, well, this is the field of international affairs. Right. And it was very, very a very definitive answer, which I understand what he was saying, because there is a formal discipline of international relations, and that was constituted in North America and Western Europe during the 20th century. And as students, we were just taught the canon, as it were, of this field, which has a certain bias, and it was not subtle, right? The assumption very much built into the study of international relations is that the field is concerned with those parts of the world that matter, and that the countries of Africa, Asia, Latin America were really not relevant to this bigger picture that the field was concerned with, right? And so that's always, I think, stuck with me. And I think as I've gone through my career, I've really tried to push for a different way of conceptualizing the international. And I think the world has moved in that direction as well. And so now seemed like a very opportune moment to examine this thing called international affairs and how we might be able to expand its scope. We don't want to ignore, I think, North America and Western Europe, but obviously things are shifting. The global order is under a considerable amount of pressure. And we really need to be prepared to offer our students ways of thinking about the international in ways that go beyond the way I was trained 20-some years ago.
Thank you so much. Dipali, if I can go next to you.
Sure.
Columbia has certainly been involved in the establishment of this 20th century consensus from the get-go. Can you talk a little bit about what's new and exciting at SEPA and how you understand these pressures from your posture uptown?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I think this is such a wonderful idea to have this conversation at this moment. I think I was I was behind the curve compared to Zach when I first enrolled in international relations as a student, as a freshman at Yale is where I began studying. I really didn't notice the way in which the field was constructed for us as students. And frankly, it's through my engagement with scholars like Zach that I've come to recognize how little has actually changed, to be honest, in the study and the pursuit of the study of international affairs at schools like ours. And I think one of the things that's exciting is to have a conversation between different schools to learn from each other. But you know, the field for me as a student and when I began teaching was largely constructed around a set of assumptions that there are a few major theoretical paradigms. All students should know them. And from them flow a set of assumptions about the import of states and the import of particular states, and really that there is the Western world and then the rest of the world we study as a set of opportunities, a set of threats, but not really on its own terms. And so one of the things that's been so exciting for me at Columbia has been the chance to teach our introductory survey course to master's students. So I teach a class at SEPA called Conceptual Foundations of International Politics. And over the last few years, we've been doing the work of really revising the syllabus and the way that we teach the course. And so part of that is, as Zach referred to, the idea of trying to make a correction in terms of who our students, whom they're reading, I guess if we can put it that way, and recognizing that there is scholarship being produced from all corners of the world, and also that the more demographically representative the syllabus is, actually, then the more new ideas and challenges to the status quo begin to emerge. And we're finding, I'm sure we'll get into this more in detail in terms of taking a set of approaches that tend to assume what is good and what is bad and what needs to be done and how to do it, and beginning to really deconstruct that by bringing us a new set of voices into the conversation. And my experience has been that students are ahead of us on this. They already think intuitively this way, even if they haven't had the material in front of them before, and that the conversation is much richer as a result.
Terrific, thanks so much. Sakiko, in our conversations, we talked a little bit about how the new school is already mobilizing, I should say, a different viewpoint. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where the Studley program is with regard to these issues and how you understand them.
Well, I guess the following on the previous speakers, well, first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity to participate in this conversation, which I think is really important. I think it serves the entire community of people who are running these international affairs programs. So I think it's a great contribution you're making to us, for all of us. And I was very amused to hear Zachariah and Dipali talk about their personal experience, because I sort of was thinking, well, I was very interested in international affairs when I was 18, but I had the misfortune, or perhaps the fortune, of going to a university that didn't offer international affairs or international relations at all, which is Cambridge University. That doesn't recognize it as a discipline at all, you know. And so, actually, I'm not sure that they even had a politics department. So, so I was never kind of trained in the traditional approach. But I would say that from 2001, when we opened our doors, the new school programs in international affairs never started with the so that the traditional conception of international relations as a subfield of political science. And we also have been building the program with a very small faculty that had a firm belief that the traditional Westphalian approach to understanding international relations was highly problematic, and so that it needed non-Western worldviews about the global order, for example. And I think our required core courses are global flows and theories, histories, practices of development, which tries to give a foundation of literature and contemporary challenges to try to understand the world as it is, building on these theoretical concepts from the classics. Polanyi is a big part of the readings. And I think there's sort of the idea that history matters. Histories of different parts of the world matters. I think I'm not sure that we sort of come out and say this specifically, but as you were saying, that the different authors from different parts of the world matter. I mean, it makes me want to go and re-examine our syllabi to say, who do we have, Polanyi and Marxe are both Western people, so maybe we should have more of the non-Western. But I think our program is not predicated on this the core conception of international affairs as built on international relations theory and sort of understanding of the world order. I think it's built much more on an understanding of global society as something that has a media and culture component to it, that has to build on understanding of history of different parts of the world. And I think the fact that our own faculty come from different parts of the world and were educated in different parts of the world, such as in South Africa or such as in Germany, such as in Great Britain, and I think that just sort of gives us a slightly more diverse foundation in the way that we approach everything.
Thank you. Now, all three of you have used at least two terms. I'm going to pick out two terms from what you've talked about and wonder if you could reflect on both or either one, your preference in the context of the conversation. So we've talked about nation states as critical actors and the key emphases in the sort of traditional paradigm, if you will. And we've also talked about this notion of the international world order, constituted among nation states predominantly in the global north, heretofore. I wonder, and I'd like to start with you, Dipali, are those touchstones as principal framing devices obsolete? And if they are, what replaces them? If they're not, how do they have to be treated differently in order to satisfy a variety of viewpoints such as those that you've mentioned on the panel so far?
Yeah, I don't think that they're obsolete, but I think that the ways in which certain assumptions that are kind of embedded in the way we think and talk about the international world order, I think those are shifting. And one of the exciting possibilities, I think, of this moment is to recognize, and we talked a bit about this in our call, there's a sense that everything is changing or everything is at risk somehow in this moment. And my sense is actually there's a tremendous amount of continuity actually in the way international affairs continues to be managed. And the fact that there's continuity suggests a possibility to revisit some of the sort of key assumptions. So I think, for example, in my area of the world, so my focus is in security studies, and I think about the greater Middle East. That's kind of my region of concern. And my first piece of significant academic work was on Afghanistan, and I was looking at a set of actors, warlord commanders, who were partnered with by the US government and became then part of the state formation and state building process after 2001 in the Afghan case. And that set of actors, commanders or warlords or whatever we want to call them, pose a lot of challenges to our assumptions about how international affairs work. They're non-state actors, they're actors that have existed in various forms that have been valorized and then vilified depending on the particular agenda of Western governments. And they are pieces of a political process and a political project in the Afghan case that confronts a lot of the norms and understandings about what governance should look like from the Western perspective. But the role that they play also exposes, I think, a lot of the hypocrisies that underpin international affairs. And so for me, I kind of use that case with my students, and I find that type of very specific case analysis resonates for them in terms of exposing a lot of the contradictions and conflicts in the international system as we understand it. And I think my sense is that this is a moment where we can present an empirical case like that to our students, and that they are equipped and excited about the possibility of using a case like that to begin to question the assumptions around what the role of the US is in the world, what the role of force is in the world, the degree to which we should take certain actors as good and certain actors as bad, and the means by which a lot of policy is made in this country that has implications abroad in ways in which those sorts of assumptions are both problematic and often unquestioned. And so my sense is that we're at a moment in which actors who have been able to mobilize huge resources and the use of force in terms that have gone largely unchecked and unquestioned, we're at a moment when we can begin to examine that in a more critical way. And so I see that happening now. And it's not about throwing out the whole system, because the system, I think, will persist, but it's about coming at it from a more critical perspective.
So am I hearing you correctly? At one level, you're talking about using some fairly traditional pedagogical techniques. Case studies have been with us for 7 decades and more.
Yeah.
But really sort of turning them upside down to not steer people toward the correct reiteration of the orthodoxies, but to interrogate those orthodoxies and to apply them in different arenas.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think, frankly, the challenge at a policy school pedagogically for me has been how to avoid the kind of prescriptive approach in which we say there are 3 options here, which of these options is the best option, and the assumption is that doing something is going to be the outcome, for a given policymaker, and that one must act and react with a particular set of prescriptives in mind, and instead to give students the chance to take, in our case, the 2 years that they have, and really have an opportunity to reflect critically on the choices they've made before, but also on the assumption that something must be done in every case, rather than to say this is an opportunity to reflect and question and perhaps sit with the discomfort, even maybe the anguish around a set of impossible choices and the possibility of a decision to abstain. And that, I think, requires thinking beyond the usual paradigm. It requires bringing in comparative politics. In my case, it requires bringing in anthropological approaches, sociological and historical literatures that sit more comfortably, I think, with not being sure that maybe there is anything to be done. I think our students are actually more comfortable with that than we assume, but that's not the way that I was taught, and I think that's disruptive.
Okay, thank you. Zach, I know a lot of your work focuses on non-state actors. Can you talk a little bit about how that should feature in any reformulation of the basic contours of international affairs education?
Yeah, so I think, as Dipali said, it's evolutionary. But it can be hard to imagine that the nation state as a political form has a lineage, right? And most people think of it as an enduring form and the natural state of how to organize global affairs. And, I think especially in the West, that perspective is pretty deeply entrenched, and so it can be hard to push back against it. But with my students, I'll often talk about the fact that both my parents were born under British colonialism, right? So my parents are older than the Indian nation. And I'm not that old. And so from a different vantage point, the question of the nation state does not seem as enduring, historically speaking. It has a fairly recent vintage, and I would suggest has a pretty poor track record, right? Hasn't really proven to be an ideal way in which to organize humanity, and instead creates a whole bunch of boundaries by definition that are quite difficult to overcome when we try to deal with collective action, right? Our general global human problems. And so then the question of the non-state becomes very relevant, and I think Dipali works on similar issues. When we were sort of first starting off paying attention to the question of the non-state at the international level, there was a very strong bias built into the political science literature against taking the non-state actors seriously as anything but nefarious entities that are causing terrorism and violence and illicit trade. I mean, that's how we think of the non-state, right? So if you think about armed groups, if you think about gangs, or you think about businesses or whatever, there's a set of assumptions about their role in the global order that are very negative, right? And what I tried to show in my work was really that actually, not passing a moral judgment on what these actors are, that in fact the assumption that they're just these chaos-producing actors was incorrect. That in fact, for many people in the world, the non-state actually may become more relevant and more essential to their daily lives than the state itself, right? And so if you accept that assumption, then how do we take them seriously at the international level? And I think what has happened more recently, and I think why we're starting to see this shift in the consciousness, not only amongst sort of academic specialists, but more generally, is that there is an awareness that the nation state is increasingly less powerful, right? If you think about what made the nation state so powerful for much of the 20th century was its sovereign prerogatives, its capacity, for example, to tax corporations and use that revenue to redistribute to the public good. Now we sort of know that that's less and less true. We know that these American corporations may have their headquarters in foreign lands and are able to avoid paying taxes to the nation state. We know with the rise of electronic currencies like Bitcoin that moving money around the world is much easier today, and that it's very, very difficult even for those governments that want to control these flows to actually control them, right? It's easy to move vast amounts of money across borders without the nation state being involved. On a whole set of issues, environmental change, human migration, we see that there is an awareness that the nation state is no longer capable of doing the jobs that we thought it should do, right? And that, I think, is what fuels kind of the rise of xenophobic nationalist movements, because people are left feeling like, well, do something. And I think that you can have a different reaction to it, which is that we don't have to view this moment as a moment of fear, right? I think if we accept that maybe the nation state was an interesting but flawed experiment, and that there are these other actors who, if we take away some of our normative assumptions about what role they're playing at the international order, we must start our analysis of the international by taking them seriously, understanding the kind of functions that they perform, understanding that they're not always going to be negative, but could also play very positive roles in the construction of global order. I think that's a much more honest approach, and I think has also the benefit of really opening up new opportunities for how to imagine this thing called the international, right? And that is what our role as intellectuals is supposed to be. And I think what we're trying to do here is to think about the international, and then also to train a new generation to actually go out into the world and build it in these ways.
I want to get back in just a moment to this question of the normative and whether we are evolving a new set of norms or something else. But first, I'd like to get Sakiko in here on this question of state, non-state, and the international order overall. How do you approach that at the New School?
Well, I think these questions of state and non-state are tremendously important, but it doesn't form the core of our curriculum or our thinking about the global world, or I hesitate to use the the term order because that's has a particular meaning and baggage to it. So that I think when I think our approach is neither to train public servants. So the focus of our approach is not centered around the idea of training people to work as public servants. Because we think of this global world, system that we live in as something where the actors are clearly states, but also businesses, civil society, media, and all of those different sectors of society are tremendously important. And in fact, most of our students don't go into government service. They go into these other sectors, and particularly to the civil society sector. So we are concerned with, we have a concentration in media and culture because we are concerned with how media interacts with politics and with society and the shaping of culture, this is sort of the interaction, understanding the world through media. And our colleague Nina Khrushcheva is trying to analyze and explain how media depictions of Russia, actually also our colleague Sean Jacobs, in his case Africa, can be distorting, and to also actively in many cases promote a different kind of understanding within the United States of African countries or of Russia and the relationships between Russia and the rest of the world. So it's a very, we started with this sort of non-state-centric view of the world and the need to understand the world in this sort of, in this way. And in fact, in my own work, which is in the field, unlike the two of you who work in more on issues of security and so forth and conflict, my work is in development, in human rights, socioeconomic rights. And so we teach development from the point of view of global inequalities and how the state negotiations and state set rules and norms, these are actually have unequal effects, that they are negotiated with asymmetric power structures that drive the agreements. So I think we have this broader global perspective and non-state-centric perspective that is actually the sort of the starting point of the way that we've constructed our program. And I think it's for me it's always my personal kind of attempt is to pedagogically, I think, is to connect the local and the global, so that understanding local challenges, whether it's climate change or the effects of tariffs, requires that understanding of global inequalities and the norms that have come from these unequal situations. So in the new school, we've also started this global platform that brings work from across the entire university on global issues. And the themes that we are working on are like decolonizing knowledge, inequalities, different kinds of inequalities, genders, and there's sustainable environment and a couple of other things like that. So that's just to illustrate that it's just not concerned centrally with the state-centered issues.
Let me go back to this question of norms and this question of a sense that things are sort of falling apart right now. And Zach, I think you put it most directly that there have been real problems in the experiment of the nation state. Should we be, two questions I think. One, are we seeing an inherently more diverse, I won't call it a chaotic, although there are those who would, a diverse environment with regard to institutional and non-institutional actors, with regard to the power of any one set of institutions or agreement among institutions to achieve a set of goals. there's that sort of concern for how this shapes. Are we ideally looking toward new norms or toward a process of constant critique of whatever settled wisdoms we have that undergird the organization of state and non-state actors? And why don't we begin with you?
That's a tough question. What I would say is that, I don't think there's any need to be romantic about the nation state. All right? I think that, and that's very difficult because obviously, our attachments to the nation state are perhaps the most powerful attachments that we have outside of the family, right? You can't kill for your religion, you can't kill for your gender, you can't kill for your sexuality, but you can kill for your nation, and that's actually celebrated, right? And so it is going to be difficult to untether the nation state away from its sort of primary identification that we all have at a very fundamental level, and that's something that we are socialized into literally from childhood, right? As soon as you're 5, 6 years old, you're learning the Pledge of Allegiance to your nation, and so it is going to be a tumultuous transition, right? And I think again, the rise of popular movements, especially like nationalist movements in many countries, the rise of right-wing nationalist leaders in many countries reflects this desire to hold on to the nation state, right? Even if it is no longer capable of producing this kind of shared prosperity that is at the core of its promise. I think that there is this very strong lingering attachments to the nation state as a form that will continue to persist for some time. Now, that being said, how do we deal with all these new entrants? And for me, I think I start with the assumption that, as I've said, that the nation state is not necessarily an ideal form. This is not a normative statement. I don't have a problem with the nation state per se. It just doesn't seem to work. And I think that a lot of the problems that we see reflect the limitations of the form, right? And so how do we now think through what a post-national world could look like, and what do we make of all of these new entrants? And for me, I see a lot of promise in the new entrants, right? I think, for example, I do a lot of work with social movements. That's my friend Fred Bauma here. He's a leader of a movement in Congo called Lucha. He's also going to be a student at the Marxe School starting in January. So we were just down in Mississippi this weekend. Fred and a group of African activists representing different social movements. And we attended something called the Southern Movement Assembly in Mississippi, which is a group of American social movements that gathers in Mississippi or in other parts of the South annually, right? And so it was very interesting to see the sort of transnational connections being built between social movements across really vast distances, right? And to me, it constitutes a new form of global international relations. One that usually doesn't enter into how we think of what the international is. And to me, it's a very promising one. Right? I felt more inspired being in Mississippi with this group of American and African activists than I do when I go to the UN and have to listen to diplomats, representing their nations. Right? If anybody's been to the UN, you know what I'm referring to. And so, how do we take seriously these new kind of relationships that are being fostered that I think are much more organic, much more bottom-up, much more reflective of people's actual relationships? I mean, you would think that a group of African activists going to Mississippi would be completely out of sorts, but I don't want to speak for Fred, but my sense of it is that having an African delegation there was really powerful, and that they were able to see these connections. Mississippi, in many ways, is actually more like an African state than New York, right? It is a state that is heavily reliant on natural resources. You couldn't escape the logging industry. They're cutting down these massive forests. There is an oil industry. The state doesn't provide much in terms of public goods to the population. I mean, it's all very familiar to people who come from Africa, right? It's the same kind of social and economic conditions that they're trying to challenge in their own struggles are here in the United States as well. And so how do we now build an analysis of the international that starts not with the nation state, but with these other forms of transnational relationships that are very pertinent to ordinary people's daily lives, right? And I think that's kind of the project that I'm interested in foregrounding at the Marxe School.
Terrific. Now, Dipali, we have a couple of different ideas on the table. I thought, Zach, you were going to go to a regional series of organizational prospects, but you're really talking about broadly distant organizational patterns based on common experiences and economic conditions. I wonder where you see this going. We're not necessarily getting rid of the nation state, but we're recognizing some of its limitations. What are we encouraging people to look toward as the modalities of international interaction in an effective and satisfying way that either transcend or perhaps are subsets of nation-state activity?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm just finishing up a book right now on rebel governance, inspired in large part by Zach's work on rebel governance in Syria, and thinking about the connection between what ordinary Syrians imagined they were doing in their own creation of a movement, an uprising against the regime, and then in their own production of governance locally, and how that intersects with a Western conception of what governance should look like. So part of the idea of norms, and are the norms changing, and how does the conversation around norms shape the possibilities of politics going forward. I think I'm still quite uncomfortable with how comfortable we all still are, even in this moment of real disruption, with believing that we've figured out what politics should look like. And so I think what's been really interesting to me in watching the current domestic political moment, and then seeing how our policies have been shaped in a place like Syria, is to see how confident we remain in the democratic, sort of the democracy promotion model, in how optimistic we seem to continue to be in the idea that spreading liberal democratic ideas is the right thing to do, is in the realm of the possible, and that part of our responsibility as Western societies and governments is to intervene still in the kinds of organic processes that are happening in other parts of the world. And so I think actually, I think there are really, so part of the challenge for me has been to look, for example, in the Syrian case and see that people are very much in their own terms constructing new forms of how they want to organize themselves and how they want to interact with the world. And yet, the persistence of certain power dynamics is very clear, right? And so that even for Syrians who have taken the ultimate risk and made the ultimate sacrifice in terms of reimagining their own politics, those processes remain still so much at the mercy of decision-making in Washington and in Brussels and in Moscow. And so I think that I'm not comfortable still with where we are normatively as something different from where we are in terms of geopolitics. Like, I don't see there being the kind of disconnect there that maybe we hope there should be. And so I think part of that is about vanishing this imaginary line between state and non-state, because actually it's all in conversation very much, for better or for worse. But part of it is also, I think, that we haven't yet taken responsibility in the West for projecting our own fantasies about what politics should look like on other parts of the world. And that in projecting those fantasies, we've somehow absolved ourselves from the responsibilities that we have for producing a lot of the problems that then we claim we're going to go in and save or solve. And so I think a lot of, maybe we'll come to this more overtly about the differences, about what's happening in this particular political moment in the US, but I see much more continuity, to be honest, than change. And a lot of the response...
In not a good way.
In not a good way.
Right.
In not a good way. And I also think we haven't had a reckoning yet with the Bush years and the Obama years around foreign intervention. in terms that I hope don't just get shoved under the rug because of the really obvious problematic things that have come out in recent years. But I think, yeah, I don't think that there's been enough of a reckoning yet. And so I think those new spaces and new possibilities are still largely being suffocated or constrained by geopolitics, as they've always been.
Dipali, I wonder if I could stay with you for just one moment more to ask you for an example of an alternative organizational structure, alternative to democracy. As I speak to people in my position, deans of schools of public and international affairs, this particular point has become a subject of often animated and even angry discussion, whether we are formally responsible, particularly in schools in the United States, for fostering democratic culture. Many people arguing, as I have had occasion to argue every once in a while, that if we look at global citizen satisfaction indices, that those satisfaction indices are not necessarily lined up with degree of democratic culture as understood in Western norms, and often quite the reverse, and that the crumbling of trust in institutions is often directly proportional to your history of democratic activity, again, under the terms of those norms. So but people get very frightened when you talk about moving away from that, and you can still go to war for democracy too. So what other kinds of things should we be thinking about?
I mean, even as I listen to your question, I get frightened, right? Because
I have that effect on me.
Because I think it's a very disconcerting question, and I certainly am uncomfortable advocating for something other than democracy. But I think part of my experience in studying the Syrian war over the last several years has been a real discomfort, is really the only word I can come up with, and a kind of anguish, actually, around the reality that my Syrian interlocutors and friends and the people from whom I've learned and the people whose work I've been studying over the past few years really were, and this is also true with Afghan friends and colleagues of mine, were and remain committed to a type of politics which I think comes closest to the democratic model as opposed to the kind of main model, other alternative models on offer. It has its own particular flavor, and it has it's much more flexible and I think in certain ways more pragmatic than the sort of dogmatic versions of what democracy should look like that I think we tend to hear in the Western context. But it is one that is anchored in a lot of ideas that I associate with democracy. And yet it has come at this extraordinary cost. But also it has not fulfilled a promise, which I think that promise came from a position of power and arrogance and fundamentally of a kind of hypocrisy from the Western space that was projected outward. And so I think for me, I'm very comfortable at this point sitting in the space of discomfort. I think we need to sit in it for a couple more years, to be honest. Creating a space in which my students get to sit in it. I have really interesting conversations in the classroom with U.S. military veterans, for example, who are just sitting in a space of discomfort with what they thought they were doing in the Middle East and what they now have to confront in terms of not just the limits of what they were doing, but the perverse consequences of what they were doing. And so I think I'm not necessarily shopping around for an alternative at the moment. I'm certainly not hawking an alternative, but I do think that the time has come for us, and part of that is for us to have a reckoning with our own democracy. And so that ends up being very useful as a way of thinking about, an exercise in eating large slices of humble pie around our own political project. And then thinking about, well, what does that mean about what we've been selling and imposing in the rest of the world? And that's about as far as I've gotten, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Sakiko, I wonder if you could take on the same question of norms, but I wonder if I could take it the next step down. If what we're talking about is a broad critique, where does our critique lead? And do you understand the work that you do out of the Studley program as moving toward a place or a direction or something more atomized? What do you see?
I mean, I think what drives us is not, it contrasts with this sort of a US-centric view of what the US sort of promotes, but rather it's driven by the core principle, the pursuit of social justice, economic justice, a more fair, equitable world in which you also take care of environmental sustainability, social sustainability, political sustainability, and on issues like democracy, it's the pursuit of democratic principles and not particular regimes. So there's a big difference between democratic principles of participation and equality and so forth, as opposed to a particular form of institutions that may be considered to have been, historically relevant in a certain part of the world, but perhaps not in others. And I think that this kind of what anchors us, and maybe this is, what differentiates our program from many of the more traditional programs, is the anchoring on these sort of basic principles of social justice and economic justice. And I want to sort of go back to this kind of continuity, discontinuity, because I think that in terms of these norms of social justice are not at all contradictory to these the previous norms. But I think that these principles are much more universal and global and less sort of ethnocentric, if I may use the term. I think also that in reference to some of the other comments that have been made about the state versus non-state, frankly, I think the reason why we live in a very confusing world at the moment is because state institutions are evolving in two different ways. I mean, there is a sort of a weakening of the public space and the public interest as non-state sectors, particularly the business sectors, become much more influential in shaping state policies. And I think, when you refer to the UN as a boring place where diplomats make statements, that is absolutely true. But what I have observed is the incredible transformation of the UN over the last 2 decades, and particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, as an increasingly vibrant and relevant space. And what is that? It's not those wooden speeches, that you can predict. It's the politics that go behind the scenes. So if you go to the Commission on the Status of Women, for example, it is so packed. I mean, the entire First Avenue is sort of packed with, it's visible. You have women in saris, in African boo-boos and headdresses, and you have this amazing mobilization of people coming to the Commission on the Status of Women at the UN in March. Just go there on First Avenue. And everybody wanting to have a space to speak, because this is a kind of a global space for sharing ideas, creating new norms. So, I think the civil society is, yes, doing work at the local level in social movements, yes, but there is also a global conversation going on that is terribly important. You can't just have a disparate number of local communities sort of strung together in a haphazard way. You also have this very vibrant civil society mobilization and conversation and networking. And in my own work, I've been trying to understand the politics behind the formulation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the role of the civil society was tremendously important. You would not have had, women's rights to land, the recognition of women's unpaid work, if it had not been for that civil society lobbying. I mean, I call it lobbying. It's not a word that's used in UN circles because I think it's not really considered to be the right thing that the UN should be engaged in. But there's a lot of lobbying by civil society on the national delegates, alliances between certain governments and national and civil society organizations to push certain and mostly progressive agendas through. So, you know, I think that these global politics, the politics and contestation of international norms, I think is very important. And the process of norm making, I think, is one of the most important areas in which we should really be training our next generation of leaders. And one of the things that we have done is to participate in the Model G20. And I make sure that our students have the role of representing the developing countries in the G20, because Indonesia and South Africa are the only developing countries in this club of otherwise middle and high income countries. And so that they get an understanding of what it is like to negotiate for a low income or middle income country agenda in a global negotiation of economic and other policies.
I'd like to pivot now to getting out of school and finding yourself a job. Can you talk a little bit, and I know, Sakiko, that you're not directly thinking of that in terms of the public service dimensions, but across the spectrum of the kinds of work that all of our institutions do, and most of our students want jobs, they'd like to eat, and so they'd like to see these, some of these principles enacted. What are the implications for the kind of conversation we're having right now on career pathways in a narrow sense, or on the nature of your international involvement in a somewhat larger sense?
So I think for me, one of the thrusts of I think one of the hard things about being an academic is that many of us haven't had a lot of real jobs. And so I don't know that we're necessarily the best advisors to our students about what kind of work they should be doing. But I think my own experiences spending time doing research abroad have informed my sense that our American students in particular are well served when they spend some time working in what's proverbially called the field, but I think that's not a very useful term. What I mean is to be working in the countries that interest them and that concern them and that they maybe think of as producing quote unquote problems that need to be solved, and therefore have a wish to make policy or make programming or spend money or make decisions around the use of force ultimately at some point in their career. And so my advice is often to get out into those countries and look for whatever type of work you can find. And that has especially been the case for students who came to Columbia thinking that they ultimately want to work in government and finding themselves at a loss. And I mean, I'm really interested to hear what my colleagues think about the current moment in terms of the question for those who are interested in serving in US government positions, a lot of our students are struggling with whether this is the moment where they want to represent the US government abroad. Is this a moment where they want to take a position in the bureaucracy? Whether it's a time when instead maybe they would rather work in the non-governmental space or the private sector space. And I'm not actually sure what the right advice is to give them at the moment in terms of working in government. And I know that I went to the Fletcher School, and I know there have been debates at the Fletcher School around how to advise students around this. So I don't know that I've come up with a particularly good set of solutions to that problem, but I think it's one that as teachers in public policy schools we should be wrestling with, and I'm not sure we've we've done enough to think through.
Thank you. Sakiko.
So most of our students, well, I think that the degree in international affairs is interesting in the diverse pathways that it creates. You can have a background in the arts, in the social sciences, in business, in anything actually, and then find your sort of carve out a niche of work in almost any field and in any sector. And as I was saying, many of our students do go on to work in the business sector, in the social responsibility types of areas, impact investment. Many of our students do actually go to the public sector, into government as policy analysts and so forth. And many of them do go into the NGO world, international development and relief organizations, and a lot of them also end up at the UN. I do find that there is this increasing interest in the United Nations, and I have to confess that I actually spent many years of my professional life at the UN before I joined academia over 10 years ago at the New School. But I think what I think we are witnessing is an era in which everything is going global. So at the New School, we think of our program as being part of the entire university, wherever they're going to go, they're going to, I mean, if you're in the economics department, how can you be an economist anywhere without understanding international economy? So another illustration is that our big part of our school, our university, is the Parsons School of Design. I teach a course called Human Rights in Global Fashion, because fashion designers, fashion businesses have to have a grounding in the global value chain, and the fact that clothing designed by Chanel or Givenchy or whoever actually gets manufactured, fabricated by women in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or in very low-income countries with very difficult living conditions, and how the global business models and how the economic structures of trade agreements and so forth actually are the reasons why there is this pressure on the worker at the bottom. And so I mean, I think that we think of our program as being part of a university where almost everybody is going to have to understand better what the global processes are, what the global structures are that is creating social injustice and economic injustice. So I think we have this sort of broad perspective. So as far as our own MA students, degree students are concerned, I think that it's very hard to sort of be cookie cutter about saying, we're training people for this particular kind of a profession, narrowly defined, like being a diplomat or something, And I think we were never conceptualized in that way, but rather we see a broad spectrum of careers in different sectors. A lot of our students go into the media actually field as well, but having this grounding in basic, ethical objectives that should ground us in thinking about the global world, I think is where we see our students going. But just to clarify, I mean, because so many of our students are interested in pursuing issues of social justice and so forth, we have special courses that kind of orient you in that way. For example, human rights advocacy, strategies for human rights advocacy, things of that kind as well.
Please, everyone, join me in thanking our panelists for a terrific discussion.